Welcome to Green and Red, Scrappy Politics for Scrappy People, a regular podcast on radical environmental and anti-capitalist politics, brought to you by Bob Bazanko and Scott Parkin.
Welcome to the silky smooth sounds of the Green and Red podcast. I'm your co-host, Scott Parkin, in Berkeley, California. Bob is out on assignment, but he will be back soon. Until then, I am talking with our return guest, journalist Adam Federman. Adam works at Type Investigations as a reporting fellow. He has written extensively on corporate and police spying on environmental activists. He's also written a number of other articles on crackdowns on protest movements, things like that. His work has appeared in The Guardian, Politico, The Nation, In These Times, and many other publications. I want to welcome Adam to the Green and Red podcast. Welcome back, Adam.
It's great to be back, Scott. Always a pleasure to chat.
Yeah. And there's a lot in the news right now, particularly concerning left organizing, left organizations, things like that. Since the assassination of Charlie Kirk, we've seen a lot of rhetoric out of the Trump administration on cracking down on the vast left networks, very much trying to draw connections to them and terrorism and domestic terrorism, quote, which is ridiculous. Adam's published a couple of articles on things related to this in the last year or so, but then also Rolling Stone just published an article about how the Trump administration is trying to go after a number of groups, including Indivisible and Code Pink and migrant rights groups, as well as foundations like Open Society. Adam, maybe just as we kick off, we're seeing this larger, broader crackdown. We're also seeing them really surge ICE into blue cities, Democratic-run cities, and Democratic states for the most part, which is also related to this. But you've published a lot around the federal government targeting climate activists around Keystone and Dakota Access Pipeline. And I'm wondering if you could maybe just start off if we're seeing a sort of pattern. Is a model we're seeing from what they did around Keystone and DAPL lay the groundwork for what's happening?
I think you could argue that the framework for everything that the Trump administration is doing right now was essentially already in place. And they're amplifying it and taking it in directions that are truly terrifying. But I do think that the federal law enforcement agency targeting of the anti-pipeline movement, Black Lives Matter, activists in Atlanta around the Cop City project, et cetera, served as precursors to what we're seeing today. And even in terms of the sort of legal infrastructure that they're trying to use to target activists, whether it's racketeering laws or anti-terrorism statutes at the state or federal level.
Yeah, some of the reporting is that the Trump administration, I don't want to say Trump, I think it's more his people, are trying to use existing anti-terror laws against their opponent, including the Patriot Act, right? And things that happened in the wake of the Oklahoma City bombing.
Yeah. He released this national security memorandum late September 25th, which followed the executive order designating Antifa as a domestic terrorist organization, which essentially uses language out of the war on terror to target a much broader sort of array of organizations and ideologies. That hasn't gotten a great deal of attention from the mainstream media, and it seems to be just another sort of tool the administration is using to target what they define as the radical left, which of course also includes mainstream liberal organizations as well.
Yeah, I guess some of my thoughts around this is that they've designated Antifa as a domestic terrorist organization, which actually it's not an organization, just to put that out there. There's no membership, there's no infrastructure, there's no bank accounts. But Antifa is short for anti-fascist. And so it seems like it's trying to designate anyone who opposes some of these authoritarian moves on the part of the Trump administration as terrorists. So anyone who disagrees with them, or if you give money to some of these liberal organizations, like Indivisible is as mainstream democratic liberal institution as it gets. And so designating them as an enemy of the state or a terror threat seems to be what they're doing. They're trying to remove all of the pillars of opposition to the Republican Party and to the Trump administration.
Right. And some of the major sort of fundraisers of that foundation, including Indivisible and Act Blue. And I talk about that in the in the Times story that I did in June, long before the recent set of executive orders and memorandums that have come out around Antifa and the radical left, the administration was targeting groups that were organizing around Tesla and including ActBlue and Indivisible. So they've been building toward this moment. And of course, it's also informed by their approach to organizing around immigrants' rights and anti-ICE protests. That's the justification that they're using for sending the National Guard into places like Chicago, Los Angeles, et cetera.
And with the on your piece on Teslas, the Tesla takedown was essentially like a very effective grassroots-led corporate campaign, right? It did a lot of brand damage on Tesla. Do you want to talk about that for a minute?
Yeah, it was surprisingly successful, I think, in the immediate aftermath of Trump's return to office. There was a lot of discussion about how protest movements would respond, and it evolved organically across a number of cities with small groups of protesters staking out protests in front of Tesla showrooms, et cetera. Grew over the course of several weeks in February and March until it expanded into this day of action. Even Elon Musk admitted that it took a significant hit on the company's bottom line. And it breathed, I think, some life into these organizations, small and large, as they were trying to navigate how to engage with and mobilize against what the Trump administration was doing and what it would eventually do later on. And I'm still in touch with a number of those activists who were involved in the Tesla takedown. And I think one of the things that I have been interested in following is what kind of action, if any, the administration has taken vis-a-vis these organizations since then. And there was a lot of noise out of the Justice Department about domestic terrorists who were organizing around Tesla. But my impression is that those organizations have simply blossomed since those protests and have continued to organize and do what they do.
Yeah, in about a week, we also, besides the Tesla takedown, we also saw these like mass mobilizations. There was a mass day of action called Good Trouble Day, and there's this No Kings thing which happened, and there's another No Kings Day here in mid-October. I'm forgetting the actual date, but it seems like there's huge energy happening.
Yeah, and I think it's easy to forget that, especially with the deluge of news about National Guard troops and military deployments to cities across the country, which is, of course, terrifying. But I think that's the point. They're trying to instill fear in the public, and they're trying to scare people away from organizing and mobilizing and engaging in First Amendment protected activity. And I do think it is important to remember that that kind of organizing is happening, as you said. Obviously, you're well aware, and people who listen to your podcast are. But I do think that the Tesla takedown was important in that the Tesla takedown organizing was an important sort of an opening salvo for movements coming out of the election when it was unclear what the sort of protest movement space would look like. Of course, it's going to look different than it did after Trump's first victory. And we had mass protests in the street, the Women's March. We had the response to Trump's anti-Muslim immigration executive order with people flooding to airports and taking that kind of action that was highly visible. And I think this time around, it's of course taken on somewhat new form.
Yeah, I think it's partially in response to the administration came in with much more of a plan in 2025 called Project 2025,
Sure.
where they knew what they wanted to dismantle pretty quickly, and they moved pretty swiftly on that, which is a characteristic of authoritarian takeovers.
Absolutely.
And I guess the other piece here is something that you wrote on last year, which is around the Palestine Solidarity Movement, which was this huge surge of activism around the genocide in Gaza. And the Trump administration has also targeted those activists in a little bit of a different way. But I'm just also wondering since you reported on that as well, what your thoughts are on how is this a continuation of that as well?
It's an escalation, clearly. Those were some of the first individuals and activists they went after. Mahmoud Khalil, the video of Rumeysa Ozturk being essentially kidnapped off the street by masked agents. It was unclear even at the time to her who they were working for, et cetera. And these videos very deliberately went viral and have the sort of same effect as the use of National Guard to occupy American cities. But I think the administration clearly used the protests against the war in Gaza as its sort of focal point in the first weeks and months of the administration by targeting international students and activists, hounding them out of the country or throwing them in immigration detention with very little due process. And the courts have finally started to kick in on many of those cases. And the administration, of course, has been challenged on nearly all of them. But it remains to be seen if campus protests were to take off again, for example. We don't know how the Trump administration would respond, if and how it would be different from what we saw in 2024, when there was also a pretty heavy-handed response.
Yeah. In many ways, those campus protests monkey wrenched Biden and Harris's re-election election. I guess the only other thing that I wanted to touch on with you today is that since the assassination of Charlie Kirk, we've really seen this sort of like really level up. And just wondering if you would want to comment on that.
It was clearly an opportunity that they were ready to capitalize on. The podcast hosted by J.D. Vance from the White House, in which Stephen Miller has been quoted many times. I think I have it here. He talked about, with God as my witness, we are going to use every resource we have at the Department of Justice, Homeland Security, and throughout this government to identify, disrupt, dismantle, and destroy these left-wing networks, which has been followed by the designation of Antifa as a domestic terrorist organization, and then this national security memorandum as well. So it's allowed them to ratchet up what they were already doing and to broaden the language of the domestic terrorist threat, which is now being used as justification for all kinds of authoritarian moves, including the deployment of National Guard to, a variety of cities. And we don't know how that's going to play out or what will ultimately come of that.
I think it's also worth it. I always want to bring this up is that the Trump administration really got into this term called political violence after Charlie Kirk got shot.
Mm-hmm.
And we did a whole episode on this recently, but it's like really worth noting that when you look at the stats, most of the political violence, particularly what involves fatalities, is perpetrated by people with more right-wing politics. And like even this weekend, a judge in South Carolina who had ruled against the Trump administration had her house burned down.
And of course, in their executive orders describing this kind of violence, they only refer to incidents that have targeted figures on the right, and deliberately omitting the assassination of the legislator in Minnesota, and the arson attempt on Josh Shapiro's home and family, et cetera. Clearly, they're cherry picking the facts that support their case and have no fealty to facts as they may be. But I guess the bigger picture is that we saw during Trump's first term an effort to characterize the left in this way. And Trump lamented the fact that he didn't use the Insurrection Act to crack down on Black Lives Matter protesters, et cetera. And of course, now we know there are no guardrails. There really is no one in the White House restraining Trump and his impulses. And if anything, is one of his closest advisors, Stephen Miller, is probably the architect of this sort of strategy targeting the left, and which makes it so much more dangerous than what we saw during the first term.
There's no Mark Milley's or Rex. It's hard to imagine some of these people as the guardrail, but Rex Tillerson, James Mattis, people like that are gone.
They were institutionalists who actually they believed that there was a separation, for example, between military and law enforcement, and that you don't merge those two institutions. And of course, what we're seeing under Trump is that very scenario playing out. And the very high profile convening of generals last week in Virginia to give this speech about the enemy within and how the military should be used, that American cities should be the testing grounds for the American military. It takes things in a completely new and I think terrifying direction.
Yeah. I'm gonna leave it there. Folks, we've been talking with Adam Federman about the crackdowns on the left and how this has been a sort of model that has been happening and developing for a long time. If you like what you're hearing, please check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and Blue Sky. And if you are watching this on video, give us a subscription. Subscribe to us on YouTube. If you listen to us on audio platform, give us a rate and review. And if you really like us, go to greenandredpodcast.org and hit that support button or become a patron at patreon.com/greenredpodcast. Adam, as always, it's great to talk with you. Look forward to talking to you again soon, because I'm sure there will be a lot to talk about as we through these really dark and troubling times.
Thanks a lot, Scott.